Okay.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Huntress. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We've got an exciting presentation ahead, but before we dive into things, I have just a couple of notes I'd like to review with everyone. First of all, we are recording today's session. So if you happen to miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch at a later time, or if you'd like to share this content with your team, you will be receiving the recording via email shortly after we conclude our live session today. Now, if you'd like to get involved with us, there are a couple of ways to do so. The first way to talk with us is through the chat tab on the right side of your screen. So when you see that chat tab, let us know from where in the world you are joining us from today. If you have specific questions, we do want you to submit those to the Q&A tab on the right side of that chat section. And we'll be holding our questions until the end of the program, so you've got the whole time to send in as many questions as you'd like, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. Finally, two of our most engaged attendees will be selected to win a $50 Amazon gift card, so be sure to send in chats, questions, and of course, fill out our post-webinar survey. Those all qualify you for our giveaway. So our topic today is improved patient experience, what that means for your cybersecurity posture. I'm joined today by Joseph Slowick, Threat Intelligence Manager at Huntress. So Joe, thank you so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. I'll let you dive right in.
Okay, let's get started. So today we're going to discuss a improved patient experience, essentially what various threat trends mean for the cybersecurity posture of the healthcare sector. So with that in mind, our agenda for today is we'll start by talking about the threat landscape as it relates to the healthcare sector and use this to then migrate into a discussion of evolving adversary tradecraft against the healthcare sector, as well as more generally, especially as informed by recent analysis of endpoint data and incidents worked by Huntress employees over the last several months. Based upon this understanding, we can then discuss defensive requirements and guidance in order to counteract this tradecraft or trends in adversary operations, and we'll close out with some concluding thoughts based upon what we've discussed today. So first, what does the threat landscape look like, particularly in reviewing the healthcare sector? So certainly we see a variety of threats, and these apply not just in healthcare, but across a variety, well, really all organizations within the cyber landscape. We have various criminal entities such as ransomware gangs and business email compromise, as well as sort of politically or otherwise motivated hacktivist operations, which may be incentivized through other mechanisms, and then state-sponsored entities frequently referred to as advanced persistent threats, or APTs. Digging into these more granularly, we can see cyber criminal activity increasingly impacting the healthcare sector, not just in terms of ransomware being a financial impact, but also increasingly related to negative outcomes for patient care. Recent reporting in NPR, as well as going back even a couple of years to Josh Corman's testimony in front of the Senate on studies associating delays in care and correlating that with negative patient outcomes indicates that disrupting operations due to ransomware is linked not just to financial loss, but also to potential negative patient outcomes. But we've seen this very recently in such events as the recent ransomware effects impacting hospital systems, resulting in diverted ambulances and other impacts that, again, impact not just the financial bottom line of these organizations, but also negative outcomes to patient care. And we see this increasing in costs with up to almost $80 billion in downtime associated with ransomware attacks on the healthcare sector since 2016. While there was a brief dip in ransomware operations identified by several organizations in 2021 and 2022, 2023 has seen a increase or return to the previously observed trend of steadily increasing ransomware operations over time, and the healthcare sector is no different in terms of experiencing this trend. But we also see the financial motivations for various cyber criminals extending not just to disruptive ransomware operations, but also into business email compromise. Business email compromise is often less considered than ransomware due to its lack of a disruptive component to the attacks, but based upon studies is often financially far more impactful, frequently consisting of fake invoices or injecting into trusted communication streams in order to initiate or um, develop a financial transaction that can cost victims hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars as a result of a successful attack. And we've seen healthcare organizations increasingly victimized by this trend, not just major hospitals and other large organizations, but getting down into primary care practices and specialist providers who are less able to weather the financial impact of such a intrusion and its consequences. But the thing is, and we've already talked about how ransomware, especially due to its disruptive nature, can result in in increasingly negative outcomes for patient care due to delays in care, having to shift resources to other hospitals or institutions. But we've also seen e-crime impacts moving beyond just trying to extort money through disruption to hacking and leaking data, which can be not just very concerning from a financial perspective as organization or criminal organizations threaten to leak information unless they're paid a ransom or some sort of other extortion schema. But as seen a couple of years ago in Finland, a network of mental health care organizations was hit, resulting in the private details of patient sessions exfiltrated by the threat actor, with the threat actor then threatening to release that data unless paid a ransom and going directly to the individuals that were seeking care to try to extort funds. This is a very deeply concerning trend of hack plus exfiltrate and then threatening to release patient care data or private patient information unless a ransom was paid. So this is another area that healthcare organizations need to be mindful of when defending their networks and understanding how criminal operations take place. But we also have hacktivists that have been involved when it comes to the healthcare landscape. Most recently associated with the resumption in conflict in Ukraine, we have seen several pro-Russian hacktivist groups threaten the healthcare sector through distributed denial of service attacks on the public-facing infrastructure of various healthcare organizations. One of these groups, Killnet, hit various U.S. hospitals earlier this year in 2023 with these DDoS attacks, resulting in disruptions in communication and lack of availability of resources that could not just impact the ability of patients to gather information or to communicate with the healthcare institution, but also the potential reputational risk of not being able to run and manage services and the perception that the hacks may have gone even deeper. But we're not just talking about criminal entities operating in the healthcare space. We've also seen some very concerning intrusions linked to state-sponsored adversaries, such as the Anthem intrusion a few years ago that impacted nearly 80 million people and their healthcare records. Precisely why this information was gathered is still up for debate, but the fact that it was lost and in the hands of a hostile foreign entity, at least when it comes to the United States, is not in dispute. And we've seen a trend based upon Health and Human Services analysis of various advanced persistent threats or state-sponsored entities operating against various segments of the healthcare segment or sector going back as early as 2008, whether this is for intellectual property theft, as we talk about things like medical devices and pharmaceuticals, to gathering information on individual patients and similar within the broader healthcare sector. That multiple entities have engaged in operations in this sector linked to countries including China as well as Russia for a variety of reasons. As far as motivations are concerned, we've seen multiple entities engaged in the healthcare space, e-criminal, APT, hacktivist, etc. The impacts of these operations, as we've just discussed, range from espionage, or just gathering information, to ransom, which can be executed through a variety of mechanisms, whether through traditional disruption of operations by encrypting systems and holding the decryption key holding the decryption key pending payment from the victim, to exfiltrating data and threatening to leak it unless a ransom is paid. Thus, we see that the health sector is a significant target, but it remains to be seen, at least within this presentation, precisely how these threat actors are engaging in such disruptive and concerning operations. And that brings us to a discussion of evolving tradecraft within the healthcare sector. That the healthcare sector is a primary target for various adversaries is easily observed. We see plenty of media reporting as well as information security company reporting on various intrusions into the healthcare sector. But more importantly, from a defender's point of view, is understanding how these intrusions are taking place and what lessons we can learn from available information in order to better align defense with what threat actors are doing. So in looking at adversary tradecraft, we're seeing evolution in initial access in that adversaries are increasingly reliant on non-traditional phishing payloads, moving away from the macro-enabled document to other more exotic mechanisms, as well as increasingly operating with exploitation of external facing applications to gain initial access or for immediate action in victim environments. Furthermore, from a defensive agent perspective, adversaries are increasingly working to blend into normal operations through the use of legitimate applications for malicious purposes, leveraging the same software and applications that administrators or regular users might use as part of their daily jobs in order to execute malicious commands to take action in victim networks. This brings us to the question of tooling, where adversaries have moved away, or largely moved away, from custom malware and tools with an increasing reliance on either commodity tools that are available to multiple threat actors in public repositories and similar, or using living off the land binaries or lol bins that are built into the victimized systems in the first place, allowing adversaries to take advantage of built-in system functionality for malicious purposes. In looking at initial access trends in greater detail, we can see initial access breaking out into a variety of specific tradecraft developments. Phishing is still a significant vector for initial access to victim environments, but is also joined with the use of legitimate user credentials, as well as exploitation of external facing applications. So let's dive into each of these individually to see just what these look like in the current environment. From a phishing perspective, going back to 2022, when Microsoft disabled by default the execution of macros in Office products, we've seen a significant shift by threat actors away from Microsoft Office-based macros and VBA to alternative payloads, such as using various container files like ISOs, image files, or various archive formats like zips, RAR files, etc., in order to package things like LNK files, shortcuts, scripting objects, and similar as part of increasingly complex attack chains that are meant to circumvent controls put into place. An example of this can be seen in this item from Bleeping Computer from a few weeks ago, where we see a very complex attack chain of a initial LNK object that needs to be executed by the user, resulting in the deployment of both a decoy document to distract the user's attention, followed by multiple payloads executing in the background in order to communicate with adversary infrastructure and retrieve further tooling as part of the exploitation chain, or the attack chain in this case. While it is important to note that this type of phishing activity requires users to interact with the payload, it is unfortunately the case that many users, often while trying to fulfill their normal duties, will interact with these sorts of payloads, resulting in successful intrusion despite the more complex nature of these sorts of intrusions. But in addition to phishing, we're also seeing increasing reliance on credential theft and abuse by threat actors. So it may often be the case that we see, say, some commodity malware gets installed through malicious advertising or some other campaign not directly linked to ransomware operators or similar, but those credentials that are harvested as part of the info stealer that gets installed are then sold in dark web or criminal underground markets and used by other threat actors to then attempt initial access into victim environments through things like external facing RDP connections, single factor VPN connectivity, and similar mechanisms. So we see stealer or banking Trojan malware frequently deployed by one set of criminal entities, which capture credentials and then are sold off in forums to other threat actors who turn around rather quickly to leverage these stolen credentials to masquerade as legitimate users and get and remotely access victim environments as an initial access factor. Frequent discussions on this center around implementing multi-factor authentication to minimize the risk associated with credential loss and hardening external facing remote access, etc. But the fact that this is a significant component of malicious actor access to victim environments, including within the healthcare sector, is without question at this point in time, and results in, aside from the very initial "it's just an info stealer" malware campaign that is often written off by defenders and quickly cleaned up through antivirus or anti-malware tooling, needs to be taken more seriously, because the knock-on effects of these credentials being leaked and then used can be very significant in leading to ransomware deployment or other disruptive activity. Finally, application exploitation has become increasingly popular among threat actors going back to 2019 and 2020, with a special attention paid to this vector in 2023, with analysts at multiple security firms referring to this as hot zero-day summer when it came to the rapid identification and exploitation of a variety of vulnerabilities in external-facing applications like VPN concentrators, firewalls, and other products that by design are meant to interact with and be exposed to the public internet. As part of this, we've seen examples such as the MoveIt file transfer application exploited as a zero-day going back to May of 2023, resulting in widespread exploitation by the criminal entity known as CLOP, resulting not in ransomware deployment, but immediate exfiltration of significant amounts of data from a variety of organizations, from private firms through healthcare providers to local government entities, with that data then held for ransom, with the threat actor threatening to release proprietary or personally identifiable information unless the ransom was paid by the victim organization. As such, we've seen exploitation branch off into several different potential avenues. There's both the access enablement variety as well as direct impact of exploitation. And in looking at these, we can see access enablement in leading to initial victim access. I exploit a web server or a VPN concentrator and then establish a point of presence in the victim environment. But also we've seen an overlap between these items in terms of allowing us to pivot to other devices, that perhaps I have vulnerable applications inside the network as well. So once I have initial access, I can leverage vulnerable applications to then move laterally. But also on the direct impact front, we've seen examples such as the MoveIt campaign, where threat actors have not used that access as an initial beachhead or other point of presence within the victim environment, but rather as the only point of access necessary in order to gain access to valuable information, which is then promptly exfiltrated to be held for ransom or extortion purposes. From a tooling and tradecraft perspective, we increasingly see adversaries operating like the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing, leveraging legitimate or benign applications for malicious purposes to blend into environments and to minimize or make significantly more difficult detection of their activity. Thus, in looking at the recently published Huntress SMB threat report, we see that in identified intrusions, while various types of malware remain common, although we'll get into that in a second, the majority of intrusions either rely on the use of scripting frameworks, so something very much built into the operating system of victim environments, or completely avoiding malware entirely and leveraging built-in system tools or legitimate commercial software such as remote maintenance and management tools for malicious purposes. Getting into remote management tools specifically, or RMM tools, we've noticed a variety of tools leveraged by threat actors, such as TeamViewer, AnyDesk, NetSupport, but especially ConnectWise, across multiple intrusions where adversaries will install or abuse already installed RMM tooling as an alternative command and control mechanism to more traditional malicious entities like say, a bespoke remote access tool or more common and widely available tooling such as Cobalt Strike Beacon or Meterpreter. Essentially, RMM tools, which is particularly in the SMB space and for smaller healthcare organizations such as private practices or specialist providers, are frequently used quite legitimately by managed service providers and other entities in order to perform IT maintenance and management of these networks. Adversaries have picked up on this legitimate use and have leveraged these tools for malicious purposes in order to gain access to victim environments and establish persistent access to these environments as well, while evading typical security controls such as immediate detections and anti-malware tooling. But also from a post-intrusion perspective, while RMM tools are, at least from a SMB level, responsible for the majority, or at least present in the majority of incidents worked by Huntress, we also see a combination of commodity tooling, items that are available either freely, such as Meterpreter, or are pirated or available for purchase in forums such as CACBOT, Iced ID, or various cracked versions of Cobalt Strike Beacon. Notable in this is that we're seeing less and less use of custom tooling associated with a specific threat actor, like we may have seen, say, 3 or 5 years ago. Adversaries have learned to avoid the use of custom tools that present a very specific fingerprint to their operations and are increasingly trying to blend in not just with normal operations, but also with each other to avoid easy attribution and identification of what threat actor may be involved in a given incident. And looking at this evolution from custom tools to blending in, we can see in legacy operations that threat actors would use custom toolkits and code largely as a way to try to evade defenses, but in the process of doing so, also leaving behind very specific fingerprints if and when that threat actor is caught. The downside to using custom tooling in this fashion for threat actors is that this is a costly way of operating. You have to develop your own software, maintain it, evolve it along with detections and so forth in order to ensure its continued viability and so forth, thus making it somewhat inconvenient. More recently, in the current threat landscape, we've seen adversaries migrate to using just whatever works. That means increasing reliance on things like lol bins and commodity tools that are available to anyone who wants to use them, such as Cobalt Strike Beacon, Meterpreter, as well as commercially available tools such as RMM software and built-in system tools. This may theoretically simplify detection, you'll note the asterisk there, but it severely limits attribution and identification. And I put the asterisk on the simplifying detection bit because we can say that, adversaries have converged on the use of Cobalt Strike Beacon or of using RMM tooling. But the nature of either how the software works or how these applications are used legitimately in these environments significantly complicate the detection and identification question in trying to differentiate benign from malicious implementation of some of these tools, especially when talking about living off the land binaries and RMM software. So that's the threat landscape. What is it that we should or could do with respect to these operations? The legacy defensive guidance is to build very strong, very large walls and then hope to keep the adversaries out, much like the ancient walls of Constantinople, the Theodosian walls presented here. And while it might have worked well once upon a time, the combination of remote services, remote work, the use of various service providers and similar means that we're dealing with very complex networking environments that require allowing a variety of entities, including our own employees, to have access to a variety of resources such that we can no longer really differentiate between a untrusted external environment and a trusted internal environment from which we try to keep adversaries out. Thus, instead of looking at this sharp division between the untrusted internet and the trusted internal environment, we really need to move towards a defense in depth approach, where we're combining visibility as well as limitations and segregation of networking environments to get as many opportunities to both identify threat actors and to counteract their activity instead of relying on a single control that, once breached, leaves us at the mercy of all subsequent operations. So when looking at layered defense and response, visibility remains vital, critical to all other actions and responses. If you can't see what's going on, you are not going to detect it, let alone be able to respond to what it is adversaries are doing. Once visibility has been addressed, responders are empowered and enabled to start responding to and mitigating intrusions. They need to be able to identify what's going on in monitored networks in order to do something about what is happening within these environments. Furthermore, the after action related to a given intrusion is necessary in order to enable both learning for defenders and evolving understanding of the very threat environment we're talking about. That means developing lessons learned based upon intrusions and capturing data related to attacks and intrusions from threat actors across either the healthcare sector specifically or the wider environment more generally, so that we can evolve and adjust our understanding of adversary actions and adapt our defenses in order to ensure that we're defending against today's intrusion tradecraft and not yesterday's observations. So in looking at the critical areas of defense, visibility again remains key. You can't defend against it if you can't see it. Basically, without visibility, all other items in terms of defensive responses are simply not possible. But what does this look like in practice? In looking at visibility, it's no longer sufficient just to have, say, a firewall and a anti-malware, antivirus product monitoring endpoints, but rather visibility consists of a layered approach of host monitoring and visibility, such as observed within endpoint detection and response or EDR products, combined with network monitoring and visibility, identifying not just what's going in and out of the network, but ideally, if possible, identifying that east-west or internal network traffic as well. And then for artifacts that are observed within monitored environments, such as unknown files or email attachments, unknown scripting objects, enabling analysis and understanding of the artifacts that enable intrusion operations as well. And critically, these items are all mutually reinforcing. Over-investing in one to the detriment of another means that we are opening up a visibility gap that adversaries can take advantage of. By combining different factors of visibility in monitoring and operations, we can enable more complex detection engineering and detection development that can start bridging the gap between adversaries blending into normal operations and differentiating between normal use of certain tooling and software and how adversaries would leverage that software maliciously. By combining, say, the host monitoring aspect of seeing a new RMM tool deployed, along with the network traffic that identifies a new segment of the network or a new host is now communicating externally, can be used to identify those anomalies that bubble up from merely anomalous to being suspicious and potentially outright malicious, to then initiate response and recovery for the victimized environment. Thus, we look to a layered and resilient defensive posture. By starting with understanding adversary operations and tradecraft, we can start aligning the visibility that we need or justify the visibility that we're requesting to capture adversary actions. We can align our investments and our security posture with what it is threat actors are doing in the wider environment. This can then drives informed response and mitigation. Again, responding to the tradecraft that exists today, as opposed to the best practices of, say, 3 years ago, when adversaries were operating in a completely different fashion, or at least a significantly different fashion. Critical considerations extend beyond just identifying that threat actors are in the environment to how do we start recovering and restoring operations. This is especially important in talking about critical infrastructure sectors such as healthcare, where we need to be worried about certainly uptime and availability. As mentioned earlier, the costs of a disruptive event such as ransomware go beyond the financial aspects to things like the quality of patient care. Without uptime, patient care is degraded, potentially leading to negative patient outcomes up to and including potential loss of life. But beyond these worst case scenarios in terms of uptime and availability, we're also talking about data confidentiality and integrity. Looking back to the Finnish example with mental health providers, are patient records secure? Are we storing them in a way that will minimize the threat if they get exfiltrated? Or are we identifying when entities that shouldn't or are not supposed to have access to these records are able to access them? Are we limiting the exposure of this information to minimize the possibility that such information could be exfiltrated by malicious entities, resulting not just in the loss of that sensitive data, but the reputational hit that a provider will suffer as a result of not being able to appropriately safeguard patient data? Ultimately, we're talking about building overall system resilience, so that through a robust defensive posture, as well as investing in response and recovery of the given systems, we're building resilience across the operation to ensure both the delivery of care, talking about the healthcare sector, and the preservation of patient privacy and similar considerations when it comes to the sensitive data housed at most healthcare organizations. So what does this leave us with? How can we conclude this discussion? First, where are we now? For adversaries, as demonstrated earlier, are increasingly interested in the healthcare space. As a critical infrastructure sector, there is a strong incentive for entities to restore operations as quickly as possible, meaning from a ransomware perspective, that there is a perception that healthcare entities will pay and pay quickly to try to restore operations. On the other hand, the information stored in healthcare organizations are significantly important, whether we're talking about state-sponsored espionage operations or the exfiltration of such data for follow-on extortion based upon the perceived desire or necessity of victims to pay the ransom. But in doing these sorts of operations within the last 3 years, adversaries have transitioned to operations that largely blend in to legitimate IT administration, making our jobs as network defenders and network owners significantly more difficult than what it may have been just a few years ago. Rather than just identifying that malicious software or obviously malicious actions are taking place within our network, even good visibility at this time requires a understanding of adversary nuance and how networks operate in normal fashion to differentiate malicious operation of legitimate tools from the benign operation of those same tools within the monitored environments. In looking at this, robust defense of any environment, but especially the healthcare environment, requires visibility across the various phases of adversary operation and awareness of adversary tradecraft in order to shape our response and build resilience in these networks to enable our ability to counteract these intrusions and to build more resilient environments to counteract threat actors. In looking at critical defensive resources, telemetry and visibility are key and underpin basically everything else. But to guide our investments in visibility, we need an understanding and awareness of the threat environment so that we know what things are important and what items maybe we can leave by the wayside, since none of us have unlimited budgets and we need to economize on certain things. But once we've settled the question of what it is we need to look at and why it is important, we could use that understanding and the data that we're then gathering to drive matters such as response procedures once a threat actor is observed within our environment. Based upon how we've orchestrated our environment and ideally how it is segmented and where sensitive or vital sources of information reside, how should we respond once a threat actor is identified in the environment, and how can we start building recovery plans around those intrusions so that we can restore critical operations to a known good, known safe state as quickly as possible, and ideally avoid having to do something like pay the ransom. So really what we're looking for here is a sustainable defensive posture within the healthcare environment. That means understanding adversaries and their operations, including objectives and purpose, realizing that it's not just a question of some e-crime actor that's attempting to extort money that is the risk in the healthcare environment, but also potentially state-directed adversaries trying to gather information for purposes unknown that can have a significant reputational hit upon the organization that is defended and monitored. Once this understanding is achieved, we can then start investing in defensive resources and visibility to counter tradecraft as it exists today. Not chasing after notional threat actors or AI-driven malware and such, but really building our capabilities focused on what it is that adversaries are doing right now so that we're combating today's threats instead of notional items or historical understanding of what threat actors do or how they operate. that allows us to then build resiliency and recovery in the event of a successful compromise. In an ideal world, we'd be able to prevent these incidents from ever occurring in the first place. Unfortunately, that is not the world that we live in, and we must assume that at some point, any organization of interest to threat actors will be compromised at some point or at some time in the future. Thus, it's not just a question of preventing, but ensuring that we're identifying these intrusions as quickly as we possibly can when they take place, and building the processes and procedures necessary to both evict adversaries from our environments and to restore operations to that known good, known safe state as quickly as possible. So with that, I am done with prepared materials, and we can certainly take some questions if there are any from the audience.
All right, thanks, Joe. I'm looking around through our questions, and so if anyone in our audience has any questions, please send them in. We do have plenty of time to tackle them. So, Joe, what are some things that our audience might need to keep in mind here? Let's say they don't work in a high compliance industry. What are some takeaways that they can pull from this session today and apply to maybe non-compliance industries? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, there's certainly less external pressure in terms of investment that may that do exist in regulated sectors, but at the same time, understanding that adversaries don't care whether you are regulated or not, whether it is HIPAA requirements surrounding patient privacy or various other items going into things like, say, NERC-CIP when it comes to the electric sector and so forth. Adversaries are notionally aware of these items, but from an operational standpoint, don't really care. The trends that we observed in terms of adversary tradecraft were across industries, thus relevant not just to the healthcare sector, but also to basically anyone operating a network. And that trend towards living off the land, blending in, and avoiding custom malware holds, whether you are a mid-market or enterprise environment or a small print shop or tool and die manufacturer with maybe less than 10 employees and so forth. So really understanding what it is that we need to be aware of, or what it is that adversaries are using or abusing in order to further their objectives, is critical in both designing defenses where necessary, as well as orchestrating and building secure networks when we're standing up these sorts of environments.
And so, as we look into the kind of the future of healthcare security, what is an emerging threat vector that you see as maybe being the next headache we all need to tackle?
That's a good question, because right now it seems that adversaries have been quite content for the last couple of years to sort of live in the areas defined of combination of phishing, cred capture, and exploitation, leading to living off the land and blending in operations onto completion of objectives. Where things might get interesting, and this is where that nasty buzzword of artificial intelligence can actually meaningfully come into play, would be in increasing the velocity of these campaigns, such as when it comes to fuzzing applications to identify vulnerabilities more quickly, or once a vulnerability is identified, of being able to weaponize it and exploit it at scale. Greater automation, which we've seen in instances like the Clop ransomware group. In a follow-up to the Move It campaign that I mentioned earlier, we did some analysis, and it seemed that given that the Clop actor rapidly exploited a large number of environments to the point where they were only able to slowly take advantage of all the data exfiltrated, resulting in a steady drip of leaks that all tied back to a period of exploitation that was really within a 24-hour period. And I think that rapid weaponization and exploitation is something that we need to look out for on the exploitation front, where it might not be the case anymore that you have a week to patch something. It might be the case that you have a few hours, maybe a day, for certain classes of vulnerability, which really puts a lot of pressure on system owners and operators to be responsive and aware of what's going on within the IT and the threat environment.
And so since we've got AI has been pretty much the word of the year, it's what everyone's wanting to talk about. I understand that in high compliance industries, they're maybe not as quick to adopt such technology. Are you seeing that apprehensiveness when it comes to bringing AI into healthcare, high regulation security?
I think overall, outside of regulated or similar sort of spaces, there's still a general defensive question of what are we going to do with AI? It sounds fancy, and there are certainly ideas around things like event correlation and anomaly detection that have been around for several years, and indeed entire companies have been built surrounding these items, and they're yet to pay off given a combination of either noise or lack of contextual awareness. So it'll come eventually, whether through increased, again, velocity and automation, such as through security, orchestration, automation, and response SOAR technologies, and similar, but we're not quite there yet, irrespective of the nature of the industry, if that makes sense.
Understood. Understood. That makes sense. It looks like Juan Carlos has asked, does there exist any matrix or any metrics that cyber threats are increasing in Latin America for healthcare?
Unfortunately, I do not have a geographic breakdown of healthcare threats focused on Latin America. It does appear in that the general trend is increasing focus on healthcare over the last several years, given that perceived necessity of getting operations running as quickly as possible in the event of breach. It would not surprise me if that trend holds for Latin America as well, but I don't have hard data to answer that at this time, unfortunately.
Awesome. Leo asks, how effective have small companies been at fending off threats?
Not as effective as I'd like them to be. There's definitely a concern when it comes to small organizations, like we're talking in the healthcare industry, the general practitioner office with 3 or 4 care providers and 5 staff members or something like that, and a few computers, but also having vital information stored in that environment. What are they doing in order to minimize their risk, not just from the loss of sensitive data, but of having a disruptive event that may even shut that business down, and extending that out to other small organizations. This is really one of those areas where having partners or other entities that can work with them that have that sort of expertise and can monitor or provide the services necessary to build a more resilient posture is very necessary. But otherwise, a go it alone approach, short of having a very restricted and very limited external facing exposure, which is often not the case, is really vital to try to improve fending off any sort of threats. I hope that answers the question.
All right, Leo, if you do have a follow-up, let us know. So our next question here is, with the use of VPNs, how does that affect geolocation aware logins?
Right. That's a good question, because there's a line of thought in information security that if you're a small organization, then why should you allow, say, external remote access from not just say Russia, but really any or entity outside of the country in which you operate. And that could be very useful in managing and minimize attack surface if that's appropriate for your organization. And so, especially for small organizations, if it's appropriate and doesn't break any business model, it's not a bad thing to do. But it's important to note that while that may be potentially a necessary step in reducing attack surface, it is not sufficient on its own to completely eliminate a variety of threats, because of the fact, as the question points out, the availability of VPN services, the ability to spin up a virtual private server through a variety of commercial services allows threat actors to basically select their geography. So while you might be able to avoid certain types of activity on its own, this is not going to completely remove the threat of external access and exploitation.
And do you see any kind of impact on remote force workforces when it comes to this geolocation access?
Well, I mean, that's the critical component because, from a hunter's perspective, it's very interesting that even working with relatively small companies, we've seen an increasing geographic diversity of small companies using service providers that have offshored individuals who are working from a third country, et cetera, and thus seeing this sort of geofencing or geolimitation impacting operations in a meaningful way. So understanding again the business model and how individuals that need to will access the environment is quite critical in building a defensive posture and then understanding what sort of items then might be observed once that posture is stood up and monitoring is in progress.
All right, well, Joe, it looks like we are all out of questions, but I do want to give you the opportunity to leave our audience with any parting remarks or any final thoughts before we really close things down.
Oh, I think I talked at everyone for quite a bit already. No parting thoughts except for visibility is key, and shaping that visibility is necessary because no one has unlimited resources or time in order to follow up on every single data source. So, understanding how threat actors are operating is a key driver for that sort of prioritization and intelligent allocation of scarce resources.
All right, well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us on Techstrong Learning. It's been such a pleasure hearing from you today.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So, to our audience, just a couple of final notes. We have been recording our session today, so we will be sending that to you via email here shortly. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website. That's securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it will be in the on-demand section. I'd like to thank Huntress for sponsoring our program today. And to everyone who is hearing my voice, thank you so much for attending today. We appreciate your time, and we just ask for you to fill out our post-webinar survey if you have an extra minute. But otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning Experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, Joe.